I am glad everyone's with us. Just remember, please subscribe, please like, and please share. Welcome everybody to our channel. Welcome. I'm glad to see that y'all were watching us live. We've got a very important guest and a very deep problem that we have.
I was looking to see who the important guest was.
Richard Howe. All right.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that caught me off guard there.
But me and my buddy Scott, which is having some technical difficulties, me and Scott was actually, students of Richard Howe. We've learned a lot of good stuff from Richard Howe. He's a very great man of God, and I actually got on the website and read his bio, and I didn't even realize how great he was.
Sorry, I'm falling asleep.
But he actually he got his doctorate. His doctoral dissertation is titled "The Defense of Thomas Aquinas the Second Way."
That's close.
Okay, that's good. And then he also, his master thesis is titled "The Analysis of William Lane Craig, the Cosmological Argument." So this guy's got a very broad spectrum. He's even wrote some really great books. I'm going to try to read this one, but he co-authored a book with the legendary Norm Geisler, who's already went on, the Religion of the Force, and he's also wrote many articles. He's wrote for our mutual friend, Midwest Christian Outreach, a friend of mine, Don Vino.
Oh, yeah.
And then also he's wrote many journal entries. He's a teacher at Southern Evangelical Seminary. And if you ever need a great professor, and this was from the words of Norm Geisler himself,
Tom Howe.
You would need to have Richard Howe. And then especially his brother, Howe. So
I can vouch for the latter for sure.
Okay. And let me introduce you, Richard Howe.
All right. Well, thanks, gents. And I hope we got some people joining us. Welcome. So what we're going to do tonight, in a moment, I'm going to share screen so you can see a presentation I'm going to do about atheism. And I'll explain kind of a relatively narrow range of atheism that I'm going to be focusing on. So let me get this going here. Now, if you are watching this, so you can't do this if you're watching it after the fact, I don't think. Maybe you could put something in a comm box, but if you're streaming this and you get why this picture is funny, don't say anything, anybody. Just always put that up just to see if anybody can get it as to what the joke is. It's really inside baseball, if you will, as far as what the joke is. So if I don't forget, then I'll tell you what the joke is before we're done. Or if I do forget and somebody reminds me, okay, so what was supposed to be so funny about that very first picture that you put up there, then I'll be reminded. So maybe Scott or Jody, one of you guys or somebody in the streaming can type it in there and say, tell us what the joke was, because it's not obvious. It's not, so if you don't get it, you're not missing out on a whole lot. It's just sort of this real esoteric joke. So what I want to do tonight is titled Answering the Arguments of Popular Atheism. So I'm going to explain what I mean by popular atheism and how it compares and contrasts with other categories of atheism and where those categories sort of come from. Now, the actual full-orbed popular atheism is actually 4 huge PowerPoint presentations long, because I do it in class. I teach a class on atheism called Contemporary Atheism, of which popular would be basically 1/3 of the class. You'll see what the rest of it is here in due course. So what that means is, since we're just going to spend a few minutes together, obviously can't go through hundreds and hundreds of slides with all kinds of quotations and things like that. So what I do with pretty much every presentation that I've put together over the years, either for conferences I speak at or classes that I teach at the seminary, at Southern Evangelical Seminary, do a little product placement there. guys. So SES, go to ses.edu is our website at the seminary. So what I do is I take these PowerPoints and convert them into slide decks, PDF documents that are slide decks. And so you can get all of those off of my cheesy looking website, but I think most of the links work here. So here's how to get to the website there. In fact, if you go there today, that's what the front page is going to look like. You go to richardghowe.com, okay? And then you'll see at the top of the screen, you won't see this hand come flying in, but right there where it says resources, if you click on that tab there, then you'll see 4 options. If during our time together, if I happen to say something like, hey, I've got a paper on my website, then you would go to papers. See, there are papers there, resources and papers, and it will be somewhere. Things I've written, things other people have written, PDFs you can download, links to things on the internet, basically Bible, theology, apologetics, philosophy, those kind of issues. Same thing with multimedia. If I say, hey, I've got an MP4, got MP3, whatever on my website, resources, and then you click on multimedia. Then the Midway Community Church is the church that my wife Rebecca and I attend in Alpharetta, Georgia. I live in the Atlanta area. And that's just stuff that I've put up there over the years when I've taught things at my church, Sunday school class or whatever. It's just, it's a lot easier to just put it up on the internet rather than run photocopies. But then the thing that's relevant for us here is the PowerPoint slide deck. So when you click on that, it'll take you to a page, and it's basically, I think it's pretty much every presentation that I do there. You can just scroll down and they're in alphabetical order. Some of them are under more than one name, so it's easier to find depending on what subtopic it might fall under. So for us, you can see right there at the top, you'll just want to get answering the arguments of popular atheism and the introduction, and I'll explain what these categories mean, but then you can just click on those and save those PowerPoints to your computer, and then you can, or actually the PDFs, and you can, and here's why you want to do that. I've already alluded to one reason. One, because I'm skipping a lot of slides. We're just going to pick a few examples. So if you're interested in the rest of the arguments, you can get the slide deck. That's one reason to do it. The other is that I may have citations to prove a point that I don't necessarily read to everybody for the sake of time. So when I make a claim and I ascribe a certain view to atheists, let's say, then you can go and if I don't happen to give the particular atheist tonight, you can go and get the slide deck and say, well, who said that? What page was that on? What was the book? That kind of stuff. All right. So that's another reason to get the slide deck so you can see all the citation. But I will give you one warning. I always give this warning when I invite people to get these slide decks. It's likely that as you go through the PDF and you're just looking at basically pictures of each slide, that you might see a slide now and then that it isn't obvious what the point is, because you don't necessarily hear the lecture that went along with it. That's just sort of a danger, because not everything I say would be put on a slide separately, right? Which has actually tempted me, and I tease audiences a lot with this joke, so if you've heard this silly joke before, it's tempted me, take one of my PDF presentations, my PowerPoint presentations that I convert into a PDF, and just stick in a picture right in the middle that is totally irrelevant, just to see if anybody would call me up someday, say, hey, Richard, I was looking at your argument against atheism, and I want to know what that watermelon argument for God's existence is, because you had a picture of a watermelon right in the middle. Then I have to tell them, say, I just stuck that in there to see if anybody would ever ask me what that was all about. So far I haven't done that. So if you see a slide and it doesn't make sense, it's only because you didn't get to hear the lecture. So you can contact me and we can talk about it anytime. So, all right. So just a few introductory comments. As far as atheism goes, this is not just something that impacts the sort of narrow field of apologists and philosophers. It impacts culture. This is a Time magazine. I actually have that Time magazine here. This is a Time magazine, came out in the 60s at the height of the God is dead movement, whatever that meant. Basically, the God is dead movement in Europe and in the United States was this idea that irrespective of the question of whether God existed, the whole theme of God has become irrelevant because of modernism, technology, science, then the general culture in Europe and the United States was beginning to feel like that God really doesn't serve a purpose anymore. That category just doesn't really fit in to modern life. Interestingly, though, right after Time magazine did a profile of some of the real movers and shakers of the God is Dead movement, not too many years later, they came out with another cover story, Is God Coming Back to Life? Because there was a resurgence, beginning to be a resurgence, even as far back as the late 60s, within some academic circles, trying to revisit the viability of the concept of God. But even then, it wasn't so much a resurgence of thinkers trying to defend the existence of God, but they were making God such an amorphous kind of category that they were trying to sort of shoehorn it back into modern Western life. Then, though, and I actually had that one too, by the way, there that one is. And then a couple of decades later, a little bit less than 2 decades later, another article. Now, this cover doesn't show you anything, but the article inside, Modernizing the Case for God. Philosophers refurbish the tools of reason to sharpen arguments for theism. So you may recognize, for example, a name like, William Blake, for example, who was an apologist not too many centuries ago, dealing with various issues about the Christian faith or whatever. In fact, you may recognize people like Thomas Aquinas, the philosopher that has really guided a lot of the thinking of Norm Geisler, my mentor and co-founder of Southern Evangelical Seminary, and whatever that means. But other people like David Hume, who was a big skeptic and brought a lot of challenges to Christianity in general and theism in particular. And then there are some of these voices. There's a young Alvin Plantinga there on the bottom right. And then J.L. Mackie, who's probably one of the most significant academic philosophical atheists of the 20th century, to be sure, in his book, The Miracle of Theism. Mortimer Adler, probably not a household name, but he was sort of a layman's philosopher, Catholic. And then Hans Kung was a Catholic as well, but a little bit on the fringes of mainstream Catholic thinking. So anyway, just give you this idea of how robust a conversation this has been, even before maybe some of us were even born that are watching tonight. Now, just a few terms to make sure we're on the same page and you'll understand how I'm using those terms. And we may say something more about the terms later if anybody wants to. I'm going to skip some of it, but if we need to visit it to defend some of these. But at least this is how I'm using the expressions tonight. Theism comes from the Greek word theos, which means God. And it's in effect the worldview that affirms the existence of God. It says God exists. Now, there are different kinds of theisms, but we're basically interested in monotheism, the idea that there's one God, mono. Then there's the word agnosticism, comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. And it has this negation at the front end. It's called an alpha privative in Greek, and it means not or no or something like that. So agnosticism is the suspension of judgment on the question of God's existence. So it's the view that says, I don't know whether God exists. And there are varieties of agnosticism. Some of them say, I don't know whether God exists, and you don't know either because it's not something that can be known. Or I don't know whether God exists, but I'm willing to entertain the arguments. But so far I'm not convinced, but I'm, maybe not. And then the topic at hand is atheism. Well, it comes from the same root word for God, theos, with the same alpha privative in front of agnosticism, meaning not or no. So it's the worldview that denies the existence of God. It's the view that says God does not exist. So you've got God does exist, I don't know whether God exists, or God does not exist, or through the spectrum here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I teach a course at the seminary. In fact, I'm teaching it this semester. We're a little over halfway through the semester, and this course is titled Contemporary Atheism. Like, how do we find atheism today in the marketplace of ideas? So what I do for the course is split the subject matter into three categories, just three categories of atheism, only one of which is going to really concern us for the balance of our time together. There's first, and these, I only have these in the order that they do so that the one I'm going to deal with tonight is the last of the third. This is not the order that I necessarily do it in the class. But the first category is academic atheism. So these would primarily be the philosophers in philosophy departments who write philosophical books and articles defending atheism or attacking theism to various stripes. So there's a whole just pantheon, no pun intended, of academic atheists that are largely, most of them are philosophers for the most part. All right. So, and if you've got questions about that, we can deal with it, but that's not going to be my topic tonight. Another was a phenomena that really began to put atheism on a lot of people's radar screen as a social movement, and that's what was called the New Atheism. These were the four horsemen of the New Atheism: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. The reason it was called new was that there was a handful of ways in which this sort of expression of atheism was distinguishable from sort of old-fashioned, if you will, the academic atheism. And I do an entire presentation just on the new, although there's a lot of overlap between some of the issues that they bring up. But the New Atheism, really, one of the biggest differences, I think, was that academic atheists typically made their case at a technical level for other academics. So as such, their names weren't particularly household names. Who's ever heard of J.L. Mackie, for example? He's not some social celebrity, right? Whereas the New Atheism wanted to take the arguments to the masses, to address these arguments for and against God at a level that had more broader appeal than the technicalities of academic philosophy. So that was one of a handful of differences between the New Atheism as it's expressed itself culturally and socially versus the old atheism, if you will, that was more academic and stuff. Then the third one is our topic for tonight, popular atheism. So exactly what do I mean by popular? Well, I don't mean popular in the sense that everybody likes it, like this is a popular restaurant and so many people go there. Although it may be popular in that regard, but that's not what I mean here. Rather, what I mean is popular is generally contrasted with academic. Now, being contrasted with academic doesn't mean it's unintelligent. The difference is this: an academic treatment of a subject is really something only accessible by other academics who are studied in that particular area. Whereas a popular treatment of a subject would be treating it at a level that makes it more accessible to a broader audience, so that it's generally free of a lot of the technical jargon and sort of really esoteric kind of points, the way it would strike most people. So you can have academics who at times will write popular level. In fact, Einstein, for example, wrote a popular level treatment of his relativity theory. I got about halfway through the table of content on that one. Okay, and then I was starting to get kind of lost. But nevertheless, that's his intention. You know, there is a real technical treatment, right, with all the deep mathematics and stuff and relativity. But then there's a sort of layman's treatment of it. But it was still by Einstein. In other words, my point is, just because it's a popular level doesn't mean that the person doing the writing isn't an academic. It couldn't write deeply. And it doesn't mean that what he wrote at that level was somehow too shallow and didn't do justice to the subject matter. But I will quickly add this caveat. You have to include inside the popular atheist, in fact, this would be true of the popular anything, you have to include within that category also those people who write on a subject who aren't particularly conversant in its technical aspects. They aren't philosophers. Now, I'll just say this without argument tonight necessarily, and as self-serving as it is to say, the question of whether God exists or not is primarily a philosophical question. Just like the question of whether methane is the reason why, Neptune is blue is a physics or astrophysics question, right? It's not a history question. Why is Neptune blue? That doesn't have anything to do with history, right? So my position is that the question of God's existence, by and large, is a philosophical question, even if it does spill out in other things like science and such. So when you've got someone who isn't conversant, particularly in the philosophical technicalities, and then they decide to write on the question of God's existence, then in effect, the most they can do is a popular kind of treatment. Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes they do a pretty good job in their sort of self-learning that they've done. But as we shall see, sometimes they just really botch the whole conversation. They're scandalized by the very fact that they don't really know much about what they're talking about. Now, don't misunderstand me. That doesn't prove that their atheism is false. You can find Christian writers that a lot of other Christians cringe when they hear them speak or read what they wrote because of how uninformed it is. They don't know much about their Bible. They don't know much about church history. They may not know much about systematic theology. Yet they're a Christian, so they're going to write stuff, and they're sort of shooting from the hips. So we've got our versions of the same thing that might be an embarrassment to the best among us, which I'm not including myself in that category. I'm just saying, if somebody wanted to read, well, what's Christianity all about? They need to get the best among us from the history of Christianity that they can access, right? So I'm not implying that because somebody is terribly uninformed to the point of they just don't know what they're talking about when they write their atheism book. I'm not leveraging that as if that shows that his atheism is false. That doesn't follow at all. So who are some of these people before we deal with a couple of examples? Well, you may know some of them, and they overlap. As you can see, Dawkins sort of falls into both camps. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. Well, both of them are scholars. Richard Dawkins is a scientist. Sam Harris has done philosophy, and he's done neuroscience. Representative books would be Dawkins' God Delusion, Sam Harris's End of Faith. There's Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett is a philosopher. Christopher Hitchens was a social commentator. In his book, God is Not Great, or Dennett's Breaking the Spell. And then I have to mention at least these next two, George Smith and Dan Barker. George Smith's book, The Atheism, The Case Against God, is the best popular level defense of atheism that I've ever read. I actually require this as a textbook in my class when we're dealing with popular level atheism. So he's got some stuff on the internet. He's very well spoken. He's very well reasoned. I disagree with his conclusions, obviously, but I respect him as a serious voice in the conversation. Barker, on the other hand, is probably the second worst popular level book I've ever read. The only one that's worse didn't even make it onto the PowerPoint presentation. It's a book synonymously by B.C. Johnson called The Atheist Debater's Handbook, and it's probably the worst thing I've ever read. But that's just my humble opinion. So, and there are others too that I list there. I won't take the time to go in, but you can get some of those from the slide deck. So what are the arguments of popular atheism? So now what I do, having split atheism into academic, new atheism, popular atheism, now when it comes to the popular, now I subdivide that into three different, if you will, styles or flavors or approaches to the question of theism versus atheism. And that is rhetorical arguments. Rhetorical arguments would be things that are clever plays on words, bumper sticker, t-shirt kind of things. And I think some of them are very rhetorically powerful. But rhetorical arguments is one of the categories that I deal with. Then also I deal with scientific. And what I mean here, again, we're dealing with popular. So I'm not talking about really deep science like a Lawrence Krauss or somebody like that may be able to get into, or even a Richard Dawkins if he thought he wanted to do that. But rather what I mean are sort of popular level understandings of science and how they may weigh in against the case for God. And then the third category is philosophical arguments. Again, not technical philosophical, but popular level types of objections that really fall more under the category of being philosophical more than they do rhetorical or scientific. So what I'd like to do, just take about 3 minutes maybe, and just show you what the arguments, just by giving you the argument, but I'm only going to deal with maybe a couple, depends on how the time goes. But here are some examples of the rhetorical arguments. Atheism is not a belief, rather it's a lack of belief. And some of these, they could be unpacked, obviously, a little bit more than I'm just reducing them to one or two sentences. We are all atheists about most gods. I'm just an atheist about one more God than you. And that one goes on to say, as soon as you understand why you reject all those other thousands of gods out there, then you'll understand why I reject your God. I'm just one more, all you do is take one more little step. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so the point here is, the theist has never been able to marshal evidence that's extraordinary enough to warrant the claim that there is this being called God. Science, this is one of my favorite. Science flies you to the moon. Religion flies you into buildings. And you can get on the internet, a lot of these, you'll see some versions of them on t-shirts or on bumper stickers, especially this one here. And I think that's probably one of the most rhetorically powerful ones I've ever seen. How about, this one's kind of funny, I like it. Axial tilt, the reason for the season. Because those Christians always have Jesus as the reason of the season, and the naturalists is going, well, no, the reason you have the seasons is because the Earth is tilted approximately 23 degrees off this orbital plane. That's why you have it. All right, what would be some examples of scientific arguments? Science is all we need to understand truths about reality, including whether God exists. This is one I want to deal with, Jody and Scott, here in just a moment. The one I picked out. How about Christianity's reacted against science because science has displaced man from the center of the universe? You remember the Ptolemaic versus Copernican models and the Galileo and these kind of things. Kind of a cousin of that one. Christianity has always stood against the advances of science. The case of Galileo is proof. So Christianity is just anti-scientific. The Bible was written by the same people who said the earth was flat. Most scientists are atheists, therefore the belief in God is not scientific. Virtual particles prove that something can come from nothing. Therefore, you don't need God to explain the origin of the universe. If God created the biological complexity of the world, he must be no less complex, in which case, the atheists say, he needs just as much an explanation as the world needs an explanation. So your God, all he does, in their estimation, is just push the explanation off one step. What about philosophical arguments? Well, here's a few. Question everything. If everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause. That may be the second one I'll deal with, one scientific and one philosophical. Who made God, or who designed the designer? Kind of a version of that God needs an explanation, since he's got to be as complex as the world. Atheists can be moral without believing in God, therefore God is not necessary for morality. Christianity requires faith, which is belief in spite of the evidence. Why can there not be an infinite regresses of causes into the past? In other words, the idea is that at some point there has to be this beginning to the universe. Well, why? Maybe it just goes back forever and ever. Can God make a rock too heavy for him to pick up? This was actually the first challenge I ever encountered as a teenage Christian. I got saved when I was 16 years old, and our sort of village atheist at high school challenged me with, can God make a rock too heavy for him to pick up? And I was both stymied and flummoxed at the same time. I mean, if you've ever been both of those at the same time, you know how troubling that can be. Why should we think that the cause of the universe is God? So maybe there's a cause of the universe, but why think that this is the God of religion? All right, so with your permission then, let me jump to the scientific one. So let me scroll ahead here. Science is all we need to understand truths about reality. And in fact, I've got to take a sip of my coffee and do another product placement there for SES. I don't get kickbacks for this, but as long as I promote the seminary, I think they'll still let me hang around down there. So that's a good thing. So science is all we need to understand truths about reality. I mean, these are actual pictures from the internet of t-shirts you can buy. Atheists, in science we trust, or science is my religion. Let me give you a few examples of that kind of thinking. In Richard Dawkins' God Delusion, he says this: the presence or absence of a creative superintelligence, that's God, is unequivocally a scientific question, even if it is not in practice, or not yet, a decided one. Right? So even if it's not yet decided, the question of whether God exists is a scientific question. How about Marcia McNutt, who was the president of the American Academy of Science and was the editor of the journal Science, the most prestigious journal in science that I'm aware of. And she did an interview in National Geographic. She said, science is the method for deciding whether what we choose to believe has a basis in the laws of nature or not. Now, what I have here are a handful of examples. Each one that I introduce, I feel compelled to have to respond to. So I may skip some of them and then skip my response to them. How about Peter Atkins? He says this, and let me tell you who Peter Atkins is here. He says, I believe that anything that has been reported reliably, anything, can be interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science. Peter Atkins, this is actually a still from the debate that Peter Atkins had with William Lane Craig in the late 90s, at the Jimmy Carter Center in Atlanta. My then girlfriend, now wife, Rebecca, and I were at this debate. And so Atkins was adamant that you don't need anything but science to explain anything else. In the context, they were talking about claims of miracle healings at Lourdes. And what do you do with these claims? And he basically said, well, either the people didn't, either they're lying when they say they were healed, or perhaps more likely, they just didn't understand the physics behind what made them get well. So they attributed to God when it maybe was just some scientific thing that we could have interpreted, right? So that's at least 3 of them that I have out there. So let me then try to answer those. Just a quick response. Let's go back to Dawkins. Remind you of his statement: the presence or absence of a super creative intelligence or creative super intelligence is unequivocally a scientific question, even if it's not or not in practice or not yet a decided one. Now let me compare this statement with something else Richard Dawkins said out of a book several decades earlier, The Blind Watchmaker. He said this: unlike some of his theological colleagues, Bishop Montefiore is not afraid to state that the question of whether God exists is a definite question of fact. Now, this isn't a change of views. He didn't change his views from what he said in the Blind Watchmaker to the God delusion. He's saying the same thing, but he's saying it in 2 different ways. Let me just see if I can unpack and illustrate what I think is wrong with what Dawkins is doing. In the context with unlike some of his theological colleagues, Bishop Montefiore is not afraid to state that the question of whether God exists is a definite question of fact. The context of that is basically Dawkins was thrilled to encounter a Christian bishop, if you will, religious leader, who thought that it's either true that God exists or it's false that God exists. In other words, he wasn't postmodern, if you're familiar with that expression. He wasn't a relativist. This bishop wasn't the kind of guy that said, well, there's a God for me, but maybe there's not a God for you. You know, sort of like, I love the way asparagus tastes, but maybe you don't. Or I like collecting stamps, but you like collecting coins. You know, everybody just kind of does their own thing. No, the bishop was like, no, it's either true or false. So if I say there's a God and there isn't one, then I'm saying something false. But if you're saying there isn't a God and there is one, then you're saying something false. Well, apparently, understandably, Dawkins was thrilled to meet some religious leader who wasn't postmodern relativist. And I think all of us, certainly Jody and Scott and I, would all celebrate the same thing along with Richard Dawkins. I started to go, hallelujah, but I don't think Dawkins would say hallelujah. But at any rate, we would go, we're grateful that there are religious leaders who are not postmodern. All right. But notice what he calls it is a question of fact. That I think we would agree with. But notice how, without changing his mind, but just saying it in a little bit more of a transparent and revealing way, in the God delusion, he says it's unequivocally a scientific question. Well, now, wait a minute. I agree that it is a question of fact, but you can't just say that it's a scientific question without defending that. You have to defend whether it's a scientific question. Now, one time, you remember at the beginning tonight, I said that I would, with no argument, maybe I'll get a little bit of an argument right at this juncture, my statement that the question of God's existence is a philosophical question. I was in a debate at Georgia State University some years ago with a leading atheist in the Atlanta area. And the Ratio Christi group had us do Does God Exist debate. And so I made this claim several times during my presentation that this is a philosophical question. And meaning by that, that whatever that looks like, the question has to be analyzed according to the methods and tools and protocols and procedures that characterize philosophy, whatever that looks like. And I got challenged by that during the Q&A, and this gentleman said, well, who are you to say that it's a philosophical question? And I was sort of taken aback by that, because the question was sort of like somebody going, let's say we're having a debate about whether this particular tree in my backyard will or won't bear fruit or flowers. And so, well, it's too early in the season, but I think that's a fruit-bearing tree you got. No, I don't think so. Well, we need to get an expert. Well, who would you get? You'd get an arborist, basically a botanist, right? Because it's a plant, and botany is the study of plants. Now, what sense would it make if somebody said, well, who are you to say that botany, that plants fall under the rubric of the botanist? Well, it's not that people picked out a subject and then said, okay, here are all the plants. Now, who do we want to deal with plants? Yes, let's get the botanist to deal with that. That's not the way you do it. It was the other way around. You found the people who dealt with plants, and we give them the label botanist. That's just what you mean by botanist, is someone who deals with questions relating to the nature and function and such of plants. So what I submit to you for your consideration is that when I say the question of God's existence is a philosophical question, it's not that somebody just said, well, here's the question of whether God exists or not. Who should we give this question to? Yes, let's give it to the philosophers. No, it's the other way around. We find the people who traffic in these kinds of issues and others, and then including the question of God's existence, and then we call that discipline philosophy. That's how it actually happened historically. So what I find in Dawkins, in fact, I've got more examples than just this one. He's scandalized by his own commitment to science, and is not even considering the fact that the methods that he needs to use to deal with this question are philosophical. And so, unfortunately, in his book, The God Delusion, he just doesn't demonstrate any really acumen in philosophy. All right. Now, there are atheists who do. They're academic atheists. J.L. Mackie, I've already mentioned. Michael Martin, used to be at Boston University, is another. Theodore Drange at West Virginia University, and others that we could name. So there are atheists that do philosophy, and they're still atheists. Okay, that's fine. But that's really where it should be going on in my judgment. Now, what about Marcia? Science is a method for deciding whether what we choose to believe has a basis in the laws of nature or not. Now, presumably, Marcia McNutt believes her own statement. She believes what she just said, right? So if so, what scientific method did she use to decide whether this belief has a basis in the laws of nature or not? Now, maybe she'll go, well, I don't think it has a basis in the laws of nature. Well, if she says that, then she's basically making my point. Namely, there are other methods than the natural sciences for deciding whether you should or shouldn't believe a certain claim, right? They don't all fall under the boundaries that the natural sciences set up for doing it. And for that matter, exactly what law of nature could possibly be the basis of that? No, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that what's going on here is that's a self-refuting statement, because the only thing she could appeal to defend this statement is the tools of philosophy. So oddly then, if she insists that all of her beliefs have to be grounded in science, the statement, all of our beliefs have to be grounded in science, is not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement. Now, which one? Did I do a third one? I don't remember if yeah, I did Peter Atkins, right? So what can I say about Peter's comment? Remember, I believe that anything that has been reported reliably, anything can be interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science. Okay, so my question is, can Atkins' statement be interpreted scientifically within the framework of natural science? Now, before you jump and go, well, of course not, it's got to be philosophy or whatever, you're anticipating that's my response. That's not it. It would seem to me that one could interpret any statement within any framework. So that's not really the question to ask. The question isn't, I don't think, can something be interpreted within the framework of modern science? I mean, for that matter, you could just as well say, well, could your statement be interpreted in the framework of the Lord of the Rings? That is to say, could I try to take your question and nest it in the Lord of the Rings story and figure out how your question might or might not be answered in that context. Well, you could do that with any question, pretty much with any framework. To me, the question to ask is, can Atkins' statement be interpreted correctly within the scientific framework? Can it be correctly interpreted scientifically? In which I would say, well, no, it can't be correctly interpreted because the statement itself is not even a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement. And Atkins is one of the harder ones to try to get to see this. He and I think Stephen Hawking would have been two that would have been scientists that would have been seemingly so hard to get them to see that. And imagine how ridiculous it'd be if Richard Howe wrote a book on evolution. And I'm not a scientist at all. Suppose I wrote an evolution delusion or something silly like that. And Dawkins or Atkins reads that and they go, Howe, you don't know anything about biology. You don't know anything about Darwinian. You've probably never read Darwin. They could think of all these things to criticize me. Many of them would be correct. I'm not trained in the natural sciences. So I think I've learned enough to know that I have to be very careful about venturing into pontificating on issues about which I have little training, right? Unfortunately, Dawkins and Atkins don't take the same wisdom. So they venture into these areas for which they are completely ill-equipped as scientists to even deal with, all right? So what's going on with these guys? Well, what's happening with a lot of these is they're committing what is known in philosophy as the selection effect. What's the selection effect? Well, if you drag a net through the water of a lake in order to gather data about the relative sizes of the marine life in the lake, invariably any life that is either too small or too large will not be caught in the net. You get that? So it throws the net out, drags through, dump it onto the boat. You got all these fish and maybe minnows, crabs, whatever. And then you try to calculate, well, you know, there's nothing any smaller than this and any bigger than that. Problem is the net adversely affected your data because the net didn't get things that were too small to fit in the net and they didn't get things that were too big to fit in the net. So your conclusions are skewed. It's as bad as saying, well, we're going to go search for seashells on the shore of the ocean with my metal detector. Well, no, seashells aren't made out of metal. They're made out of calcium carbonate. So you can't go with a metal detector across the sand and just insist that, hold on. That's my, we have some severe weather in the area and I forgot to turn off my weather alert. So I'll probably get blown away by a tornado because I just turned it off and I'm not hiding under the table right now. But if I just disappear, then, you know, the Jody and Scott can carry on. So anyway, but yeah, you can't just do your metal detector and say there aren't any seashells out there. Well, no, the metal detector is a selection effect. So my accusation is many atheists, not the academic philosophical ones necessarily, but this popular level, many of them that I've read just don't realize how their own assumptions and methods and protocols and procedures all just adversely affect their ability to weigh the evidence because it's illicitly selected the evidence or skewed the evidence. So we see this fallacy when physicalists like a Dawkins or an Atkins, that everything that exists is just physical, completely miss the evidence for God because they're being scandalized by their presuppositions. Because I would argue the evidence is philosophical, metaphysics, if you will, and stuff. So it reminds me of a cartoon I saw or heard, and I have modified it for my purposes here, where one guy says, so what good is philosophy? He said, well, I don't know. I mean, what good is science? Well, science, now you're doing philosophy, you know? And there's a theological version of this. Somebody put Bruce Banner in Thor, and Bruce Banner says, you know, you don't really need theology, you just need Jesus. And Thor goes, well, who is Jesus? He goes, well, Jesus is, now you're doing theology. As soon as you start telling me who you think Jesus is, you're doing theology. As soon as you start telling me what you think your science is, you're doing philosophy, namely the philosophy of science. Okay, we got time for one more, gents? Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So how about one philosophical argument? So let me make sure I've got the, so let me make sure I got the one that I planned on doing. So just bear with me just a second. Yeah, we'll do this one, all right? So philosophical argument. If everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause. Now, I'm not making this up. Dan Barker says this: everything had a cause, and every cause is the effect of a previous cause. Something must have started all. God is the eternal first cause and creator, sustainer of the universe. The major premise of this argument, everything had a cause, is contradicted by the conclusion, God did not need a cause. You can't have it both ways. If everything had to have a cause, then there could not be a first cause. All right. Well, we'll see what we can make of that. What about George Smith? Atheism, the case against God. Every existing thing has a cause, and every other. So there you go. Every existing thing has a cause, and every cause must be caused by a prior cause, which in turn must be caused by a still prior cause, and so on, until we reach one of two conclusions: either we have an endless chain of causes, an infinite regress, or there exists a first cause, a being that does not require causal explanation. But of course, if you go for B, then that contradicts the original premise that everything has to have a cause. So B isn't an option either. Sam Harris makes the same argument in his letter to a Christian nation when he says everything that exists has a cause. Space and time exists. Space and time must therefore have been caused by something that stands outside of space and time. And the only thing that transcends space and time and yet retains the power to create is God. Now, Sam is trained philosophically. I'm not sure what level of degree he has, but I know he's done some, like at least a bachelor's level training in philosophy, which will be significant here in a moment. Daniel Dennett is a philosopher. What does he say? The cosmological argument, which in its simplest form states that since everything must have a cause, the universe must have a cause, namely God, doesn't stay simple for long. In fact, Barker, again, just to follow up on something he said earlier, the old cosmological argument claimed that since everything has a cause, there must be a first cause, an unmoved mover. Notice this: today, no theistic philosophers defend that primitive line, because if everything needs a cause, so does God. Well, hang on to that. Today, no theistic philosopher defends that primitive line. Michael Ruse, I had the pleasure of having a dialogue/debate with Michael Ruse some years ago on our campus on God and morality. I love Michael Ruse, but nevertheless, he says this again: we find an argument with somewhat different form, but for our purposes, enough to focus on the central inference. Everything has a cause. There must therefore be a cause of this world, and this we call God. So I've got others from Michael Velasquez and his book on philosophy, and Robin Le Pontevoix, who is also a philosopher, and not only a philosopher, but a philosopher of religion. So what can I say in response to this? Well, among the philosophers throughout history, there is no version of any argument for the existence of God that says that everything must have a cause. Nobody's ever made that argument. Now, I'm not saying there isn't some, 10-year-old kid who has a website that looks a lot better than mine, who's bloviating on these things and he doesn't know what he's talking about. So he might say that. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. I'm saying of the literature of the people that deal with this stuff and do it for a living, you'll never find this argument anywhere. You only find it by people that are uninformed and are critics of the argument. In fact, I can't think of anybody that says it that isn't a critic of the argument, Christian and atheist. There is one version of an argument for God's existence that says that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. You've got that. In fact, that's what the Kalam cosmological argument is that William Lane Craig made famous. This is what I did my master's thesis on. What I did was I took Craig's argument and tried to extend a defense of it against objections that came out in the literature after Craig's book, in the philosophical literature, and even some objections that I personally encountered when I would give the argument on a campus, let's say. People would raise their hand, well, what about this? Okay, that's pretty good. Let me see if I can deal with that. And I tried to incorporate those into my master's thesis at Ole Miss back in long time ago. All right. So you've got a version that says everything that begins to exist. There's another version of an argument for God's existence, a cosmological argument is called, is that every contingent being must have a cause. Well, what's a contingent being? Well, that's going to be a philosophical category, and it's going to have something to do with the relationship of the kind of thing a given object is and the existence of that thing and that relationship between its essence, what it is, a tree or a dog or God, versus existence and how those two relate. Right? So that's fine, but none of this had anything to do with beginning to exist. So you've got beginning to exist needs a cause, contingent needs a cause. That would be the argument from Thomas Aquinas. That's the philosophy we traffic in at Southern Evangelical Seminary. And it impacts our hermeneutics. It impacts our understanding of the existence of God, the nature of God, the classical attributes of God, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, all of those superlative attributes. It impacts our understanding of the nature of human morality, the connection between human morality and God and the goodness of God. All of those things splay out from this Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. A book I would recommend, by the way, in this regard is Gavin Kerr's book, The Aquinas' Way to God. The proof in the De Ente et Essentia. De Ente et Essentia is on being and essence. It's just the Latin. And the cool thing about Gavin Kerr, besides the fact that this is just a tremendous book, and it's fairly modest in size, it's not a big tome, but it's just brilliant, was that when I first ran across him, he had really long hair and he was wearing a Frodo shirt. So I thought, well, you got to read that guy's book. I vicariously have long hair through other people. In fact, I vicariously have hair through people, long or short, okay? Because I used to be a long-haired, for lack of a better word, hippie back in the 70s when I was a rock and roll drummer and had hair down to my shoulder blades and stuff. So I think it got too heavy and it just fell out. I think that's what the problem was. But anyway, I highly recommend Gavin Kerr's book. Jeffrey J. Lauder, who started Internet Infidels, one of the very first clearinghouses of atheist material on the internet, says this: no respectable theologian or theistic philosopher has ever made the claim everything has a cause. Yet various new atheists have proceeded to attack that straw man of their own making. I remember when reading The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, where he attacked that straw man and cringing. There are many different cosmological arguments for God's existence, and none of them rely upon the stupid claim everything has a cause. Okay, that's Jeffrey's wording, not mine. And he's saying that as a formidable atheistic voice on the internet. Now, where did this straw man come from? I got two elements, I think, which began it. Bertrand Russell, in his essay, Why I Am Not a Christian, and I will say this about Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. Until Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion, until then, I think the one treatise in recent history that has disabused more Christians of their Christian faith probably was Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. Students going to university and reading Bertrand Russell and walking away from their faith, or at least walking away from theism if they weren't necessarily Christian, just becoming atheists. So he's that important in terms of his influence. I think now Dawkins has probably surpassed him in terms of just, at least anecdotally, how many people, how many students have read The God Delusion and have walked away from their faith. And I go, I think taking a cue from a friend of mine from South Africa, when she met a young Christian who was reading Dawkins and he was being sort of stumbled, she said, there are a lot better atheists to read than Richard Dawkins. You know, she was going to, meet him, call him and raise the ante a little bit. Hey, you want some good atheists, read J.L. Mackie or Michael Martin or Theodore Drange or some of these guys. Don't waste your time on Richard Dawkins. So what did Bertrand Russell say? Perhaps the simplest and easiest to understand is the argument of the first cause. It is maintained that everything we see in the world has a cause, and as you go back in the chain of causes further and further and further, you must come to a first cause, and that first cause you give the name God. That very simple sentence showed me, as I still think, the fallacy in the argument of the first cause. If everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. So I'm thinking, okay, it looks like maybe a lot of these people, this got sort of injected into the conversation because of the influence of Bertrand Russell. But where did Bertrand Russell get this? Isn't he a philosopher? Why would he say this? Well, he was a philosopher, and he's probably one of the most important philosophical logicians, philosophers of logic and mathematics. But he wasn't a philosopher of religion. I think he was sort of underinformed. But be that as it may, I've got one more element to the explanation, and that's David Hume. These atheists are perhaps taking their cue, including Russell, either from Russell himself or from Hume, the famous Scottish philosopher in his dialogues concerning natural religion. So what does Hume say? Well, in effect, notice here what he says. Whatever exists must have a cause or reason of its existence. That makes sense. Of course, God has a reason, anybody would say, right? But that's different than having a cause. Okay, so we're not saying God has a cause, even if you can explain why it is that God does exist. You don't necessarily have to appeal to a causal explanation. So what I think happened is that Russell just truncated Hume, and in his seminal article, Why I'm Not a Christian, had such an impact on subsequent religious thinking in the Anglo-American world that now it's gotten incorporated, and now you've got even philosophical atheists like a Daniel Dennett making that specious claim. But let me give you one last example, because I never look over an opportunity to beat up on presuppositions. So maybe that could be a topic for a future program. Scott, Jody, is my beef with presuppositionalism. Greg Bahnsen was a tremendous Christian man, okay, and he's a philosopher. But look what he says in his book. So this is just all the more an indictment, given that he's a Christian. How should we understand the fundamental premise in the cosmological argument? Everything has a cause, or every object has an origin, or better, every event has a cause. Well, those aren't the same things. If this is taken in a universal metaphysical principle, then the embarrassing conclusion reached by the apologist would be that God too has a cause or origin. Yeah, it is embarrassing. That's why no apologist ever makes that argument, because it's embarrassing to make. So that's exactly why they don't make it. And there's reasons why you would find somebody like a Greg Bahnsen, who is philosophically trained and who does believe in God and was an evangelical Christian, still making that same straw man. There are reasons why he does it, which are beyond us for tonight. Okay. Now, Jody, Scott, I've got enough to go until like Thursday of next week. All right. So, but I'm willing to cut off there. If anybody has questions or comments, humorous anecdotes, balloon animals, interpretive dances, whatever they want to do.
Oh, great presentation, Richard Howe.
Well, you are so welcome. Thank you.
And you're a phenomenal asset amongst the Christian community. I love your debates. I love your teaching. And you're just a great man of God, a great teacher of God. And we really appreciate you joining us tonight, because you're one of the top scholars out there. So,
well, if you say too many more nice things, you're going to have to send you another $10 bill.
Oh, okay.
For you know, because that's how much it cost me to get you to say this much nice stuff about it.
Well, don't
no,
worry,
I appreciate it. I appreciate it, brother. I love doing this. You know, always let me know if I can do anything for you guys. I always love making these kind of presentations, but didn't know if either of you had questions or anybody else.
I do have questions, and I'm also watching the YouTube chat. If anybody has a question, you can post it there. Let me go with my first question. You mentioned some philosophical arguments that the atheists use, and I've been looking for something for, an argument that the atheists like, which is as simple and as powerful as something like the Kalam cosmological argument. Because because of Christian apologetics, we have teenagers, who can rattle this simple syllogism off, and we have all kinds of these cosmological, yes, teleological, axiological, ontological arguments. But what do the atheists have? I've never heard a good argument that is, that simple logical syllogism. Have you ever seen such a thing that ends, with the conclusion, therefore there's no God, or God can't exist?
Yes, probably the first thing that comes to mind is one I know you're already familiar with, and that would be, and it would depend on how it's formulated as to how simple and succinct it is, like a Kalam argument can be, and that is the problem of evil. So somehow, depending how the premises are worded, that if God is all powerful and all good, then he would and could prevent evil, but there is evil. Therefore, either God is not all powerful or not all good, or he just doesn't exist. Some version, which, by the way, came on the radar screen of contemporary thinkers from Hume as well. from his dialogues. That was another apologetic issue that we're dealing with today. Doesn't originate with Hume. It goes back to ancient Greeks, either Erastus or Epicurus. But it goes back to ancient thought. So I think the problem of evil is one. But there's a family of arguments that I think are very, very interesting because of the philosophical issues that they raise. And the family of arguments are these. They are arguments from atheists that try to show one of two things. How either one particular attribute of God that theists generally think God must have is somehow internally incoherent, that has some internal logical or other kinds of problems. Like, for example, the idea of omniscience. And say, is it possible for there to be a being who knows everything? All right. Well, depending on what you understand knows to be and other things, you can show logical conundrums that are sort of equivalent to, could you have a painter paint a picture of everything? And you say, well, no, because as soon as he paints his picture, the one thing he left out, he left himself out painting the picture, right? So if he says, okay, let me include in my painting, me painting this painting. Well, what has happened? He's created another level of him painting himself, painting the painting. And he will never be able to get back behind such that he could always include everything in his painting. So it's sort of a similar kind of thing. It's a little bit more sophisticated than that, but it's a similar kind of thing where utilizing some principles in contemporary logic and supersets, for example, if anybody's familiar with that, they try to show how it's not logically possible for there to be a being that knows the every true proposition. That's interesting stuff. So it's either that one of God's attributes is incoherent, yet if there is a God, he'd have to have that attribute, therefore there can't be this God. Or sort of a cousin of that, how there are any two attributes are mutually incompatible. They're not compossible is the word. Like, for example, let's say God is omnipotent and God is free. And if you want to add in omniscient to make it even tighter. Well, why would those be sort of impossible to have simultaneously? Because the argument will go, let's say if God is free and that means he knows everything, then he knows what he's going to do tomorrow. But if he knows what he's going to do tomorrow, then he can't not do that, which means he doesn't have the power to do other than what he knows he's going to do, which means he's not omnipotent. So if he's omniscient, he can't be omnipotent. But if he has the power to do other than what he knows he's going to do, then it turns out he knew something wrong because he didn't do what he thought he was going to do. Therefore, he's not omniscient. So omniscience and omnipotence seemingly are incompatible. Or you could spin it as he's not free to do other than he knows he's going to do, so that the freedom and the omniscience. So they're called the incompatibility of the divine attributes arguments. So a good resource, this is another textbook for my class, the Cambridge Companion to Atheism. So Cambridge University Press has a multi-volume paperback on just about everything when you're talking about philosophy, the Cambridge Companion to. You can get the Cambridge Companion to Aristotle, or the Cambridge Companion to Aquinas, or the Cambridge Companion to Hume, or it might be themes like Cambridge Companion to Atheism, Cambridge Companion to Natural Law, these kind of things. So what these books are chapters written by contemporary scholars on various aspects of that issue, including, in this case, atheism. So all but one of these chapters in there is an atheist. The only exception is William Lane Craig has an article in here where he's dealing with atheist arguments against the existence of God. So this is one of our textbooks that we're doing. And you have those incompatibility of the divine attributes dealt with. But even more, I would recommend, if you want to sort of undiluted, is Michael Martin. I mentioned him earlier. He was a professor of philosophy at Boston University. His book, The Impossibility of God. This deals with it a lot more than just this one. This one's like one chapter. This has a whole bunch of chapters on the impossibility. So those two, Scott, I think are are the two major sources of atheistic thinking. There is a third one, but I don't see it as much, but some of my friends would tell you they probably see it more than any, and that's the hiddenness of God argument. And that idea is, if God is the God that you Christians say that he is, why is it so hard for me to be convinced he's there? Why do I find the evidence so unpersuasive? You know, why would he let it be where I'm not able to push it across the finish line? Seems like he would make himself known more clearly. So the hiddenness of God. So you got the problem of evil, the impossibility of the incoherence of the divine attributes, and then the hiddenness of God.
All right, thank you. That's very helpful. I think I'd like to continue this line of argument because you were just giving some logical arguments, philosophical type arguments, but we do see that in popular atheism especially, most of them are rhetorical. As you showed in your slides, they usually go for rhetorical arguments, not logical or philosophical arguments. And
that's right.
So that appeal to emotion, it seems to be the strategy rather than appeal.
Well, that's
to logic.
especially the case with the rhetorical category, that they're appealing to sort of emotion. And also, you may have noticed, some of them are not so much an argument against God's existence as they might be just an indictment on religion broadly considered. Like science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into buildings. Well, that's not so much a proof that God does not exist, strictly speaking. So I'm cheating a little bit, but now I'll have to say this as a tag on that, and I know you guys will appreciate this, is that in my judgment, the consistent failure of these arguments has everything to do with the bad or lack of metaphysics, proper sound metaphysics. So when they're often running about what it even means when we say God is omnipotent or God is omniscient, I would just go, that's not even in classical theism, whatever that means, this view of God and his nature that you can trace from the church fathers up well beyond the Protestant Reformation. That's not even what the omnipotence even meant. That's not even what omniscience even meant. It's scandalized, I think, by contemporary analytic philosophy. So they're cashing out our claims about God along the contours of contemporary analytic thought. And as a Thomist, I would just go, well, that's your problem right there. That's why you shouldn't be analytic. You should be a classical or Thomistic in your metaphysics, whatever any of that means. And that may or not mean anything to some people, but that's what we do at the seminary.
All right. Now, when it comes to the cosmological argument, how do they answer the need for a first cause, especially those atheists who recognize that we're not saying everything that begins to exist has a cause, or everything needs a cause, but only that which begins to exist has a cause? What is their answer? We don't need a cause. There's an infinite regress. Which is the best answer from atheists?
Some of them will challenge the conclusion that you can't have an infinite regress, and that can get fun and exciting and sophisticated when you get into infinite set theory, transfinite math, Cantorian thinking, and mathematics as to whether or not it is sound or not. That's one thing that goes on. Another thing is they challenge this idea of contingency, of whether that's even possible. And there, again, I think the mistake is they're not understanding contingency as a metaphysical category. What they've done in contemporary analytic thought is they've made necessity and contingency logical modes. They're modal operators. And I go, well, there's your breakdown right there. When we say God is a necessary being, the atheist goes, well, these modal operators, necessary, possible, impossible, those are called modes. Those modal operators only apply to propositions. They don't apply to things. You have propositions that are necessary, like all bachelors are unmarried, right? So that's necessarily true because of the logic that the argument goes, that bachelor as the subject already contains unmarried in it. So the statement, all bachelors are unmarried, can't be false because it wouldn't be a bachelor if he was married, an adult male, right? So, and I go, well, I just reject that. I say, I understand modal operators as logical operators, but what the claim is historically in Aquinas about God's contingency is not a logical characteristic. It's a metaphysical characteristic. And it has to do, I know I'm bringing up more things that create questions than probably I'm answering, but it has to do with how one understands the distinction between an essence, what a thing is, like I'm a human, or this is a giraffe, or this is a tree. Its essence, it's what it is. The relationship between that and its existence, it's that it is. And so this is incredibly thick and robust in the literature as you go into the past, but unfortunately, for reasons that aren't particularly interesting for our purposes tonight, this kind of thinking has just gotten eclipsed. So you find it very rarely, especially in Protestant, and even more narrowly, especially in evangelical thinking. In my experience, an evangelical hears that a Southern Evangelical Seminary is Thomistic, and they break out in a rash because it sounds Catholic to them. Now the Catholics are thrilled to go, well, it's about time, we've been waiting on you. And I go, this has nothing to do with Catholic versus Protestant. This kind of philosophical thinking you find explicit more than a century after the Protestant Reformation in the Puritans, in people like Puritan, John Owen, Stephen Charnock, even James Arminius, for heaven's sake, even if you're not so particularly reformed in your Protestant tradition or your non-Catholic tradition. So I lobby for these philosophical starting points, and then it just changes the contours of how the objections can be answered given these kind of things versus how they're answered given a more analytic way of talking about stuff.
Yeah, whenever we tell evangelicals about the position of SDS, I like to emphasize it is Thomistic metaphysics, not theology.
That's right. Yeah.
We're headed down that other path.
That's right. So there may be some places that we concur with Aquinas' theology for sure, but that's not what is motivating us. It's his metaphysics. It's basically Aristotle with the modifications from Neoplatonism a little bit later, and then Aquinas' own innovations. And his innovations had to do with the concept of existence, whatever that means. I mean, we know what existence is, but when he said whatever that means philosophically. Yeah, I know. So I think we're the only seminary, certainly the only one I know of, that are evangelical seminaries that take a strong stand on these this Thomistic tradition, including natural law. In fact, I was just on, I think I said before we went on live, I was on television interview earlier today about some of the gender issues that were going on in public schools, teaching transgenderism going, in various legislative efforts. And the subject came up of natural law. And because the host knew who SES was and knew that perspective, and he visited that during our interview. So I was like, oh, good, we're getting some people's attention, hopefully.
All right, thank you. Last question from me, is in regard to the use of science by the atheists. They think that, or they seem to think, even some of the quotes that you gave, that scientific conclusions demonstrate that there's no God, or God is implausible, or some of the things that are taught in the Bible have become impossible or implausible because of scientific conclusions. However, they don't seem to understand that the principles upon which science is based are not themselves demonstrable or provable by scientific method, but they're philosophical underpinnings. Can you explain that briefly in a way that a general Christian audience could understand?
Yes. So one of the things I was thinking as you were teeing your question up was a lot of times the scientists will be convinced, or I shouldn't say scientists, someone may be convinced by the scientists that there's no reason to believe in God since science is on the brink of explaining everything. In other words, it's sort of the God of the gaps accusation, to say the only reason people have believed in God is because they used God to explain things that they didn't understand scientifically. Lightning, that's what we got going on right now where I am, lightning and thunder. Oh, the gods are doing that. And then they explain that. And so as science develops more and more, the argument goes, then the things left over for God to do get fewer and fewer. He's just running out of stuff to do. So they're going, there's every reason to think that someday, this is Atkins' argument against Craig, there's every reason to think that someday scientists will just know everything. We'll explain everything, and then there is no need for God. But more to the question that you asked, which is more sophisticated than that, is this idea that, and this came up too in the Atkins-Craig debate, interestingly, is the fact that science traffics in data points, categories that are themselves not the subject of science, but are the preconditions of science. Like, for example, science deals in the concept of causality. I don't know any scientist who's careless with the idea that events happen by causes. In fact, it's fair to say to a large extent, what you mean by a scientific explanation of anything is that you've identified its causes. When COVID breaks out, what is all this? What's going on? These people are getting sick. Oh, it's a virus. There's your explanation. Well, what is that explanation? It's causal. The virus causes. And then go, where'd this virus come from? Well, they think it came from, what's that? It's causal. So cause has a tremendous foundational role to play in science. But what cause is, and whether there are different kinds of causes, like as Aristotle would identify, efficient causes, material causes, formal causes, final causes, whether any of those are or aren't relevant to a understanding of the world is a philosophical question. It just is a philosophical question. But yet science can't get along without that as a working, as fodder to work with when they talk about the physical world. I also think that things like natures, the fact that things have natures, the fact that there's a such thing as a human nature, what Christians identify and we understand from Scripture to be being made in the image of God, that there's a difference between, let's say, a human and a roach, right? Or even more a plant. If you run over a flower in your driveway, okay, so, ran over a flower. But if you ran over a toddler, you would be mortified. Well, why do you care about the toddler more than you care about a flower? Because it's a different kind of thing. It's not just its function. It's not like you're worried about running over a toddler only because you think maybe someday that toddler will grow up to be, will cure cancer. That's not your reasoning. You're not hoping someday, oh, we don't want to kill babies because one of them might cure cancer someday. That's not how we think. Even knowing that, well, he might grow up to be another Hitler for all we know, we still wouldn't be indifferent about running over a child in the driveway, right? The only explanation of that is some people might want to call this, it's not the word I would use, the intuition, that there's something about the kind of thing that it is that makes it we value it differently. Well, science deals in kinds of things. We already said virus, that's a kind of thing. And you can deal with planets, or you can deal with plants, or you can deal with rodents. You can pick out different kinds of things. But what is the discussion about kinds? What is a kind? What constitutes a kind? Is every different attribute a different kind? So if I'm a bald white man, and then I have this non-bald black man, are we two different kinds? Or are we both the same kind, namely human, and we have different attributes? That whole discussion, attributes versus the nature of a thing, that whole conversation is philosophy. It's a conversation that's been going on for 2,300 or more years, actually more than that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that any given position is the right position. I do think there is a right position, but it does at least make the minimal claim that this is a conversation worth becoming acquainted with if we're going to try to plant a flag and build an argument there is no God or there is a God, and that traffics in these things like causality and kinds, what philosophers call universals, the difference between a substance like a tree and then it's a property like being green versus brown. All of that, this is a conversation that's robust in the history of thought. If we're going to state claims utilizing this data and these categories, then then we have to be prepared to try to explain and defend them, which in my experience, few scientists ever do in my reading. And, maybe there's some out there I haven't read, but they don't really own up. I tell you, a great resource in this regard is Edward Faiser's book, The Last Superstition, A Refutation of the New Atheism. It is a cookies on the bottom shelf written for the non-philosopher, how it is that science as we know it today couldn't even be science were it not for some minimal commitments to things that are philosophical. And then Faiser goes on to say, and you take those philosophical points and you arrange them a certain way, you've got the cosmological argument that demonstrates the existence of God. And if you don't like the conclusion of the cosmological argument that God exists, then you're going to have to get rid of one or more of these categories and data points. And as soon as you do that, you just evacuated of your science of even being able to be science to begin with. So it's a masterful work, I think. I highly recommend The Last Superstition by Edward Faiser, F-E-S-E-R. Looks like Fesser, but it's pronounced Phaser, like the weapon in Star Trek. Your phaser.
Yeah, I have read The Last Superstition. So thank you for answering that question. Part of the reason I was asked, or I asked, is because as I'm hearing those quotations from the atheists, they seem to assume that they don't have as much of a burden of proof as we do, that we're starting back behind, but they're already just looking at scientific claims. But all that science is built on a mountain of philosophy, that they have just as much a burden of proof as we do, if not more. And
I think so.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And whenever I've been asked to debate the existence of God, I generally just want the debate to be framed as a question. Does God exist? And that way we don't have to quibble over who bears the burden of proof. In fact, one of my rhetorical arguments that I deal with is, well, atheism is not a belief, it's the lack of a belief. And they will tell you the reason why they're arguing for it being a lack of a belief is because then they're saying we don't have anything to defend. We're not saying God doesn't exist. We're just refraining from saying that he does exist. And you're the one saying that he does exist, the atheist says, so you bear 100% the burden of proof. And I go, okay, well, that's an interesting conversation. Pending that, why don't we just debate the question, does God exist? And if you say no, you can give your arguments. And if I say yes, I'll give my arguments. And then we'll stop having a debate about the debate and start having a debate about God. I don't mind having the debate about the debate, but if you only have limited time to do it, when you got a debate, each guy got 20 minutes, you don't want to spend 10 minutes trying to defend what atheism means as a word. But at any rate, yeah. So yeah, we all have a burden of proof when we make these claims like God does or God does not exist.
All right. If there are any other questions, or Dr. Howe, you could tell us. Oh, wait, who's there?
Oh, this is Bill, the atheist.
Hey, Bill, the atheist.
Bill.
Hey, you guys have really ratcheted up your thing here. My Lord, I'm not used to listening to someone that actually knows what they're talking about. My gosh. Whoa. Yeah, thank you very much. I have just thoroughly enjoyed this. And I actually, oddly enough, I agree with like 90% of what you say. By the way, we have an atheist Christian book club, and we're going to be reading a book. I think it's called 3 Christian Views on Science. And it's by Michael Roos, who I'm sure you're familiar with,
yes,
and Paul Copan, who wrote He's Got a Moral Monster.
Yeah, I know Paul personally. Yeah, he's a great guy. And Michael Roos is a great guy too, by the way.
Well, the book's a little dry, but obviously you'll probably find it fascinating. You can appreciate it, but it's 3 views on Christian. You can probably just look up the authors and find it.
Yes.
But I'm going to ask a couple questions. This is April 1st,
Please.
By the way. We're going to have, but here's my 2 questions. So since I'm not used to dealing with people that actually know what they're talking about. So here's my question. Okay. In Genesis, you have the creation of the sun on the 4th day, the earth on the 1st day. You got that wrong. You have the plants on the 3rd day coming way too early. You have the the first human sort of thing is the Australopithecine 6 million years ago, 65 million years ago. The dinosaurs died, but Genesis has them created on the same day. So they just seem to get everything wrong on the Genesis. And I believe it's a narrative. I believe they were talking, this isn't analogy or myth or whatever. They thought they were talking about reality. It was a real narrative. So if they can't get that wrong, right, how in the world can we trust them on matters of salvation and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something to which a lot of people have dedicated really their whole lives of trying to deal with from both ends to attack what looks like obvious falsehood, or to defend what some people think are obvious falsehood. So a couple of things to say. First of all, tonight, and this is not a bailout, I'm just trying to set a context.
Right.
Tonight's subject is whether God exists. So whether the God exists is the God that the Christians say wrote the Hebrew Bible and then the Christian New Testament is important to us as Christians, but it's down the road from what we're dealing with here, right? So I tend to just be relatively neutral with respect to these, for the added reason, not only is it not directly connected to the question of whether God does or doesn't exist, but also it gets into areas that are not my area at all. So I'm not an Old Testament scholar. I couldn't defend the Hebrew word for anything. The only thing I know about Hebrew is it goes right to left. That's about it. I'm not a scientist, so I couldn't tell you Australopithecus from the Homo erectus or whomever. And I'm not trying to just act like these things are unimportant, but I just know my boundaries. So maybe Scott or Jody are more conversant in those kind of things than I. I do know scholars, though, who would defend a more or less straightforward reading of the Genesis account in light of what contemporary science says. So all I can do is to say, hey, you might want to read these guys, which I wouldn't be surprised if you probably already have read them.
Well, I used to be a big Hugh Ross devotee. I'm sure from your film, Progressive Creationism. And,
yes.
That has some, merit because, the Cambrian explosion, you see this, or 5 billion years, whatever, but a pretty sudden outburst of new created forms, okay? And,
yes,
it makes a lot of sense, but it has difficulties too. The other question I had was, if you have Homo sapiens, or you have death and disease before the fall. For instance, we found cancer in dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
We found, dinosaurs eating each other, millions of years ago. So if you have death and disease as the normal course of things, how it impacts the atonement? Why did Jesus die if it seems to be the normal course of things and it wasn't a result of the fall? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And there's a large contingency of Christians who would acknowledge that you had death and disease before the fall.
Right.
And that like Hugh Ross, and that death and disease are completely compatible with the characterization, and God saw that it was good. The reason that is, for some, this wouldn't be Hugh Ross's perspective as far as I know, is will have everything to do with what the word good means metaphysically. And then the implications for what the word good means metaphysically for the narrower category of moral good. All right, so there's a difference in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition between good and then moral good. And so that the question of Jesus's work on the atonement addresses the issue of moral good of human beings and has nothing to do necessarily as the atonement with death and disease of dinosaurs. Now, to be sure, Christians disagree. There are some that say that the death and disease didn't come in until after the fall, and they try. But that's a theological dispute that people have. I'll listen with patience to both sides of those. But what I'm interested in is the philosophical angle. And I think that there's no philosophical reason why someone has to be committed to the notion that there was no death or disease before Adam and Eve's sin, because what pushes that argument one way or the other is how someone's going to slice up the theological side. That is, how does it compare with other verses of scripture, and we render them internally consistent. If a person thinks they have to do that, which I would want to do as a Christian who believes in inerrancy and things like that. But yeah, it's, you're getting into areas where, Ken Ham and Hugh Ross will slug it out.
Oh, I know.
Till Jesus comes back, and I go, I'll let them. In fact, I heard Jason Lyle and Hugh Ross debate on the age of the universe.
Right.
And it was pretty interesting because they're both astrophysicists. And I thought, okay, this is a lot more robust a conversation than I even could have imagined as a non-scientist. So I can't referee. I tell you what I will say, Bill, in all transparency, and I'm saying this as a non-scientist, okay? I'm not trained in science. But if somebody pressed me, let's say we're all sitting around a coffee shop, so I couldn't hide behind the fact that, well, we're all got a time constraint because we're going to, I couldn't get away, and you're pressing me on this stuff. The science says this, the science says that. How do you deal with that? I think what I would admit because I'm a young earth creationist as well, is that it looks to me like from where I'm sitting, most of the science out there does seem to conflict with a young earth perspective. I think that's probably the case. But of course, a century ago, all of the science conflict with the idea that there was a beginning of the universe. The fact that the universe began a finite time ago is a relatively recent. So if we'd have been living 150 or so years ago, someone could have just as easily cornered me to go, do you realize all of the science contradicts the fact that there was a creation, that in the beginning God created. So there couldn't be, because we know the universe has always existed. And I would have had to admit it back then. I still believe what Genesis is saying, but I grant I can't answer the scientific argument. Well, now I'm kind of in that boat now when it comes to some of this other stuff. So I just direct them to other resources to say, well, you can deal with this particular philosopher, or this particular scientist, or whatever you want to get into some of that stuff. And it sounds like I'm sort of bailing out, and I am, because I've learned to be careful about venturing into areas that go beyond my expertise. To go, I would just embarrass myself by something. I try to leverage some argument, and you'd be able to go, how? They haven't believed that in 50 years. And I go, oh, really? I didn't get the latest memo.
Well, those are good points. And let me just admit that atheists are just at a quandary about these fine-tuning arguments. I don't know if you mentioned those.
No, I did not. They do come up in a certain context in my scientific PDF slide deck thing you can see. But again, it's something, I'm a secondary and tertiary source.
The improbabilities of the universe being so fine-tuned with the gravitational constant, the weak and strong nuclear force has to be just right. So many things have to be just right. Oh, the expansion rate of the universe. If it expands too fast, you're not going to have galaxies. Too slow, you're going to have a big black hole. And there's a lot of matter. There's 100 billion galaxies with hundreds of billions of stars. All this, including dark matter and dark energy, everything's got to be just precise. And even Stephen Hawking says it has to be fine-tuned to like 100 billion or some crazy number. And I've heard my fellow atheists and, some really brilliant people say, we just don't have an answer. So,
Yeah. Well, that's that more narrowly, the implication of those things with respect to the biology, there's a sort of information theory, the DNA and these kind of things is what led Anthony Flew from being an atheist to a theist. As far as I know, he never became a Christian, but his book, There Is a God, it recounts his trek, and it was because of the science in that regard. And I know a lot of
wow, because the information in the DNA, the nucleotides, the guanine, adenosine, and so forth, the 4 nucleotides, it's not the chemical makeup, it's the order that they're in.
It's information, specified complexity. Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of people have tried to dismiss, or at least some atheists that I know. John Shook, I debated him at University of North Carolina in Greensboro some years ago, and something, I don't know if I brought it up or somebody brought up Anthony Flew, and he tried to dismiss the significance of somebody of the stature of an Anthony Flew as an academic atheist becoming a theist. He tried to dismiss that on the grounds that people were taking advantage of him in his cognitive decline towards the end of his life. And turns out none of that's true. He didn't have any cognitive decline. He had aphasia,
Right.
which is a neurological condition where a person loses the ability to speak what they're thinking. And as that got worse, people confused his impediment of speech as if his cognitive faculties were declining, and they weren't at all. And the way to prove that to oneself is that you can still find, at least the last time I checked, on YouTube, an interview with Anthony Flew before he wrote his book about the subject that he eventually wrote his book about, and listen to Anthony Flew himself describe his change of thinking. And it should prove to everyone's satisfaction that this was a canard that some atheists were raising to do damage control because they didn't want to have to admit. But of course, even if Anthony Flew becomes a theist, that doesn't prove God exists any more than you becoming an atheist doesn't prove he doesn't exist, right? It's part of the conversation, to be sure. But, you know, it could still be the case that God does not exist, even if Anthony Flew became a theist. Or it still could be the case that God does exist, even though Bill became an atheist.
No, I agree 100%.
You know, yeah.
I agree 100%. But just let me say, I have thoroughly enjoyed listening to you, and it's just been, your arguments are so coherent and well thought out, and I'm just amazed at it. And thanks to you guys for having you on.
Absolutely, my friend. Absolutely, you are more than welcome. Let's get the conversation going sometime. Jody and Scott both know how to get in touch with me, so maybe, you know, we can email, and you can try to convince me of atheism while I try to convince you of theism.
I don't know. Your arguments are pretty powerful. I'm just stunned.
Well, that's why we love having Bill on this show, because he's open-minded and he's well-informed and intelligent, and we can have a friendly discussion.
Absolutely.
So Bill, I wanted to ask you, those people that you know who say we're really stumped by this, the design that we find in the information in biological systems, did they provide any suggestions of how it might be possible in some other way other than from a mind?
You know, it's the, you know, million universes or whatever, you know, all these universes.
Multiverse.
Well, there's bound to be something if you have, I even forgot the name of it. You know, the infinite universe thing or whatever.
Multiverse.
Multiverse.
Multiverse,
Thank you. And there's there's some mathematical proof, but there's really no hard evidence. And just like the origin of life, okay, there's not a clue to that. And I don't know if you read what's his name's book, Signature of the Cell.
Yeah, Stephen Meyer.
Stephen Meyer. I mean, he says he has 5 reasons why RNA is not going to assemble. And if they're very powerful, and if you can't even get RNA off the ground, plus you got to get DNA off the ground. Even if that happens, you got to have a cell wall. You've got to have enzymes that speed up these things 100%, you know, or 100 times. You got to have the proteins to make the DNA, and the DNA to make the proteins. The homochirality problem, where you have to have 20 amino acids, all the amino acids have to be left-handed. You would think they'd just be, you know, equal. So it's just problem after problem. I think it was Crick that said he's given up going to these origin of life meetings because they're just so useless. So to be honest with you, we don't have a clue.
If there's a multiverse, then why is the Atlanta traffic so bad? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, I
can't we just take up some more room here?
Yeah.
I like the multiverse idea because it's a violation of Occam's razor. You know, let's make something far more complicated. Let's multiply
You're
causes
exactly right.
to the infinity. It's the worst. It's probably the worst violation of Occam ever conceived of. So great idea, guys. Hey, Dr. Howe, you had put up the picture of Bertrand Russell at the beginning and told people that there was a joke there. Now you have to explain the joke, please.
Yeah, so you get the joke because that's a picture. That picture is probably one of the more prominent atheists of the 20th century. Even though he's not real conversant in philosophy of religion, he was a very highly celebrated thinker in his own right. So what I did is I found that picture of Bertrand Russell standing in front of the blackboard and just Photoshopped. So I have this atheist introducing me to teach a course or teach a thing on atheism. So that was the joke. So Scott gets it because he recognized who Bertrand Russell was. But most people wouldn't recognize him, understandably. It's not like his face is real famous. But so, yeah, I just thought it was sort of a friendly jab at the atheists to have one of their biggest voices introducing me to teach against atheists.
right.
You got any more questions for Richard, Bill?
No, I repent in dust and ashes there, Jody.
Oh, hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Oh, goodness. Which was funny because I really didn't give him an adequate answer to most of his questions because they're just so far a bit beyond my wheelhouse. So.
All right, it's been good. I appreciate Richard coming on, and please subscribe to our channel and like it and share it and send it all over the world.
Amen. All right.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Howe, for coming out. and
You
sharing
are
with
so
us
welcome.
your time. We
You're
really
so
appreciate
welcome.
you, and especially since we, are students of yours, we really love having our teacher here.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been my
stay
pleasure
safe.
for sure.
Stay safe
Right.
from tornadoes, and turn your weather alert back on.
I know. I'll turn it back on. I want to go out and see what kind of lightning's going on around.
See if your neighbor's house is around still yet.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
Ciao. Das Vidania.
See you, Richard.
God bless you.
God bless.